Thank you very much, Chad, and good morning. So, we'd like to thank all of you and the conference organizers for including me. You know, listening to that list of stuff that I guess I do, I was drawn to the Sesame Street question. I have a 2-year-old son, and Sesame Street questions are much on my mind. Which one of these is not like the other? And actually, I don't think we're that divergent, but it could seem that way on the surface. But I'm also reminded of a story I heard about Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary Summers. He's back in administration in a different role these days, who's famous for being an extraordinarily brilliant guy, like my co-panelists, but also, at least at times in his past, not the most socially graceful person. And he had an inflection point in his career, and he realized that perhaps that was going to hold him back from the heights of global leadership that I believe Larry aspires to. I'm going to change my ways. I'm back in Boston. I'm going to do things a little bit different. He's known for also not only his brilliance, but his focus on economics issues. I'm going to try to reach more people and talk with them and express an interest in their interests. He was walking through Harvard Yard, and he ran to someone who looked quite smart, and he said, "Excuse me, I'm just going to cut right to the chase. Would you mind telling me, what's your IQ?" And the young lady said, 200. He said, "Oh, terrific. You must be a hydrologist or a meteorologist. I'm going to get interested in that stuff. Here's my card. I'll buy you a cup of chowder sometime soon. We'll talk about meteorology." Walks a little farther. He runs into someone and says, "Excuse me, just want to get right to the point. What's your IQ?" 175. "Oh, terrific. You must be a seismic engineer. I'm fascinated with that. Here's my card. I'll buy you some hot apple cider. We'll get together. Fantastic." Walks a little farther, gets closer to the law school, I guess, and bumps into someone and says, "Excuse me, what's your IQ?" 95. Oh my goodness," said Larry Summers. I'm really terribly sorry. I'm just not that interested in reinsurance law. But I hope some of you are. I sometimes describe it as the most interesting business that no one has ever heard about, and I think that's true. After all these years, my mother, it seems, dimly aware of what it is that I do and what our company does. She knows that it's something to do with these large loss events that show up on CNN and big insurance claims, and going to Disney World. More on that in a moment, but beyond that, it seems to escape her. So I do come from the legal department, and there's the disclosure. It'll be available on the site. When I'm asked to introduce our company and our industry to folks, I'm sometimes asked, what are the virtues and what are the limitations? So I scratch my head, and I've come up with a couple of limitations, and I'll start there. So reinsurance is a tremendous business, a great industry, and provide great value to our customers and the communities we serve, but we don't do all things. And in particular, reinsurance is not transformative. It doesn't make things that which they ain't. For example, standing all these years, it hasn't been making me any taller, stronger, fitter, or less bald. Well, my wife continues to hope. But it does transfer spread risk, create efficiencies, and send important behavioral signals. And more on all of that in a moment. Even more importantly although maybe not to my wife perhaps, reinsurance doesn't transform unsafe homes, bad land use planning, into safe homes, wiser land use planning. Speaking of observable data sets, these are 2 homes on the same block, I think they're across the street from each other, that were impacted by Hurricane Charlie. And we're always looking for data. We want to see what actually happens when wind and water hit structures or when the ground shakes. And we've been getting more and more data, unfortunately, during this period. It's a high storm frequency period as we measure these things. And before this time, people used to worry, you'd see these differentiations in outcomes in closely compacted structures. And we don't hear much about this anymore, but we used to hear about extremely localized wind phenomenon. I used to call this the magic tornado. But it turns out the magic tornadoes hit badly constructed homes built before modern building codes. Now, we haven't been able to disprove the existence of the magic tornado, although we've actually tried to install anemometers ahead of the wind field. But I'll tell you, we haven't found any yet. And what we have found is that post-code homes that were built to enforce codes, perform pretty well. Homes that are pre-code are not. And that's exactly the case with these 2 homes. But in and of itself, reinsurance, our product, without help, is not going to make the families in the one house safer and as safe as their neighbors across the street. From another perspective, while human safety is the big game in town, in my opinion, reinsurance in and of itself, acting alone, is not going to reduce expected loss. And that's what we'd like to see. We have an interest in seeing the expected losses of natural perils reduce over time. But I'll also add, neither does a shift, and we can see this. This we can observe. We have 40 years of experience with the flood program in the U.S., shifting the burden from private companies who want to absorb that risk to a public system has also, in my opinion, not produced a marked reduction in expected loss. Indeed, I would personally argue kind of quite the opposite. And I'd say reinsurance can be confusing. It is B2B. Our customers are insurance companies. Fundamentally, at its most simplistic form, reinsurance is insurance for insurers. Our clients can sometimes measure in the low couple of hundreds. It's folks like Allstate and State Farm. It's not consumers. I'm not sure I would know a consumer if he or she hit me over the head. And in turn, consumers don't understand reinsurance well, or perhaps in my mother's case, maybe not at all. And notwithstanding the great benefits that they absorb, the fact that most of the cost, the dollars to repair their homes, their businesses for a large natural catastrophe are likely coming from the reinsurance space, they don't see that because we're not visible to them. And the benefits that risk-based pricing plays over time and setting behavioral signals for better land use planning, better business decisions, better home safety decisions, that's also more opaque than we'd like to see. We appreciate that, and we're working on it. It's one reason why we're here today. And I'd also say reinsurance the benefits that we provide can be diminished by trade barriers. The great benefit we provide on a financial basis is portfolio optimization and spreading. We eagerly take, for risk-appropriate prices, Oklahoma tornado risk and Florida hurricane risk, which is the big driver of loss in the United States. But we blend that into a global portfolio that has Japanese earthquake exposure, Chinese typhoon, which is a big growing hazard, other perils like Australian hail. Very efficient in our global portfolio, actually very concentrated in something like the Florida hurricane public structures that we see, and even to a degree in the National Flood Insurance Program. Concentrated risk rather than risk spreading, which you can get by accessing the global private reinsurance and capital markets. But that makes us vulnerable to trade distortions. And these days, the big debate around that is on certain federal income tax issues. If anyone is interested in that, please grab me afterwards. But again, it's a vulnerability of our business that we're akin to, and it will deprive businesses and consumers of the U.S. of some of the maximization of the benefits that we can bring. And the economics of reinsurance can be misunderstood. I'm sure the folks in this room, people who care about floods, understand at times the perception of insurance, and therefore implicitly reinsurance, is pricey. From our perspective, what we think we're hearing is certain types of land use, certain types of construction are inherently risky, and the cost of insuring and ultimately reinsuring them is expensive. I actually think that we believe that Donald Trump owns this particular house, but the cost of insuring this house, the risk that's attached to it, and the picture tells 1,000 words here, it comes with a certain cost. Imagining that cost is not there, wishing it away, just ain't gonna make it so. Okay, now I'm conscious of the time, but this is actually a much longer list, and I'll try to focus on a couple of the key highlights. One benefit of reinsurance is it's big. It's a big industry. Perhaps not only the best industry no one's heard of, but maybe the biggest. And in part, that's a function that we operate on a global scale. But also, as big as we are today, we could be bigger. Our biggest driver of losses of cost is losses, the expected losses from the events that we cover. The other major driver of cost, and it's smaller than the first one, is the cost of capital. So I know it's true of us, I think it's true of our competitors broadly, but generally speaking, we've raised the amount of capital that we view as necessary and adequate to serve the current private market size that we see in existence today. If those markets change over time, we can all right-size our capital. And to the extent anyone is following this, what you see in the private reinsurance market is fairly mammoth returns of capital. But the market's elastic, and if our markets grew, there's no reason to believe we wouldn't add capital over time to support growing demand. And for folks in this room, the reinsurance market has led the way in helping Americans recover financially from recent catastrophes. And to show for the home team a bit, I've traveled here from Bermuda. The Bermuda reinsurance market alone has paid an outsized share of these perils because we have a specialist market in catastrophes. And again, if folks care, I'm sensitive to time. I'd be happy to spend more time on this, but you can see some of the data here. I think importantly for this audience as well, risk-based pricing delivers key behavioral signals. It sends signals about behavior. And we believe, and it's a personal opinion of mine, that risk-based insurance and reinsurance are perhaps the best way to inform tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, arguably millions of market participants and consumers about the risks of their conduct, the risk of their construction, the risks of their siting. That over time, consistent risk-based pricing signals, we believe, should lead not only to reduced exposure, but enhanced human safety by rewarding people for risk-reducing activities and imposing a cost on risk-enhancing activities. More transparency around risk, we believe over time will reduce moral hazard, ought to lead to fewer inadvertent cross-subsidies, ought to relieve the drain on the taxpayers. But again, most importantly, over time, send signals and have a favorable impact on the risk of loss of human life and loss of property. In that regard, it's interesting to note that outside the United States, flood is a risk that's principally in the private markets. The recent windstorms of this quarter produced a lot of flood losses, and we are absorbing that. That's principally a reinsurance market loss. The big UK floods of recent years were principally a reinsurance market loss. And if you believe that at least in some of these jurisdictions, we've seen better land use planning, better hydrology, better water management, I would submit that at least a portion of that, in a couple of instances, is tied to more attuned risk-based pricing related to waterborne hazards, including flood.